Hey there, I'm Michael Kane and welcome to Bodhi Talk, a channel dedicated to helping you open to life more fully. In today's episode of Bodhi Talk, we are going to talk about ways of managing, working with, and preventing stress, overwhelm, and anxiety. This is going to be a great episode with lots of information, lots of great tools to help you deal with stress, anxiety, and overwhelm. And so I hope you'll join me. Okay, so again, I'd like to talk today about how to work with, manage, and prevent stress, overwhelm, and anxiety. It's a pretty crazy time right now, and so this is something that a lot of us are dealing with, and it's kind of normal in a way. There's a lot going on, a lot of activation going on, and things, like I said, are a bit crazy. So there are all kinds of different reasons why we might be experiencing overwhelm and activation in our systems. It could be things from the past. You're getting triggered by things that are happening right now. It could be the mind is creating a kind of perceived danger in different ways, or perceived threat, and so that creates a lot of anxiety and activation in the system. And what we're just talking about, it just could be the current challenges and situations that are going on around us here in our country, in our own families, in our own lives, in the world. And so it's very challenging, and so we need ways and tools to be able to work with this, and we need ways that we can kind of know when it's coming so that we can kind of stop it before it gets too challenging for us. First thing I'd like to talk about is our relationship to activation, to stress, to anxiety, overwhelm. A lot of these things are kind of different words for the same thing, really: energy and activation. And it's really important to understand that a lot of times energy is being created to do something. And so it's not the enemy, it's not something that's bad, it's just a kind of phenomena in the nervous system that we get triggered in particular ways, or we feel threatened in certain ways, and energy wants to do things. And sometimes we can be experiencing activation because there are emotions and things that we're kind of stuffing in a way, or not really paying attention, and so all kinds of different ways. But really, it comes down to one of the most important things is, what's your relationship to what you're feeling in your body and experiencing in your life. And so especially when it comes to anxiety and activation in the body, if you are, aversive towards it, if you think that it shouldn't be happening, you are really creating more energy in a way, more activation, because you're basically saying that this is a threat. Whatever's going on in my body right now is a threat, which then creates even more fight-flight energy, right? It activates the nervous system and creates a lot more adrenaline, epinephrine, neoepinephrine, and lots of energy to kind of fight something. Of course, the problem here is it's happening in my body and I can't really find it. And so it creates a lot of dysregulation in the system. So it's really important that we try to create a different kind of relationship with what's going on in our bodies, especially when it comes to activation, anxiety, overwhelm, things like that. And that's already going to help a lot, because if I'm not fighting it, if I can change my relationship to a kind of openness or befriending, and trust that things are going to move through, then already I'm going to feel a little bit more settled and a bit more expanded. Next, I'd like to talk about how the mind plays a part in creating anxiety and stress in our lives, basically through creating perceived dangers, ruminating, worrying, expectations, things like that. So it's really important to notice what thoughts and stories and beliefs that the mind is creating. Basically, one of the definitions of anxiety is an overestimation of perceived danger and an underestimation of resources and coping skills. So we'll just take that first one, an overestimation of perceived danger. So we know from science, from studies, that if I'm, sitting around ruminating and worrying about something that could happen in the future, that's actually going to create fight-flight. It's going to create energy or activation in my system. And then, of course, a lot of times we begin to ruminate or continue to think about these things like losing my job or worrying about my kids or something like that, or not having enough money, or these days worrying about the COVID-19 and friends and family. And so that continual worry keeps ramping up the nervous system, keeps creating this physiological experience of threat response. It's not necessarily the body's fault that it's doing that, it's the mind that can create these thoughts and beliefs and stories and then continue to ruminate them, so the system is continually getting ramped up. So when it comes to the mind, it's really important to be able to see that, and if we can see it, we can begin to practice interrupting that kind of neural pathway or those thoughts, so that we don't keep ruminating or worrying about something. And that's going to be really helpful in lowering the activation and settling the nervous system, which will help a lot. The other thing that can be really important is to have a lot more understanding about what's going on. A lot of times anxiety and stress can be from a misunderstanding or not knowing what's going on or not knowing the truth of things. So it's really important to see if you can get good information, truthful information. Even if it's a little scary, like you have to do some kind of medical procedure, it's really much better for the nervous system and for your system and your mind when you actually know what's going to happen, instead of kind of hiding like, oh, I don't really want to know. But actually, by knowing and understanding what's going to happen, there can be less anxiety. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about some ways of working with stress, overwhelm, and anxiety and activation, and really giving you some tools that you can use to be able to manage and work with these things. So the first thing that I like to do when I'm experiencing a high activation or anxiety or such things is I like to keep it really simple, and I also like to keep it more in the physiological end of things. So the thing is that if we're trying to think our way out of stress or overwhelm or anxiety, it's really going to be difficult, because it's not really happening in the mind. It might be being created by the mind, but it's not happening in the mind. The sensations of activation and overwhelm and anxiety are really happening in the body. So, and the other thing that happens, that when we're feeling anxiety, when we're feeling overwhelmed, we're probably down in our lower brain. We're down in our reptilian brain, our survival brain, and our limbic system. So we can't really think our way out of it. We can certainly use the mind to help us, but we can't think our way out of it. So a lot of things that help with anxiety and activation have to do with the physiology. And so the first two that I'd like to talk about, which are kind of the go-to simple things that we can kind of remember, they seem quite simple. You might think, oh, this is so simple, how could it work? But in reality, it's because we are being able to come into the physiology and do some things that actually help to reset the nervous system and help to create some regulation. And so the first thing I'd like to talk about as far as a tool would be orienting. So this is really the thing I go to first. A lot of times when we have stress or overwhelm or activation, we kind of have this tunnel vision. And the eyes, the vision gets really tight. We might even feel a little bit dizzy. We might feel, like pressure in the body or in the head. And so the first thing I like to do is I like to do what's called orienting. And what orienting is quite simply letting the eyes kind of naturally move around the environment in which you're in. So if you're outside, you're letting your eyes notice, kind of almost in a very natural way, letting them notice what's happening. If you're inside, you're noticing what's happening inside. So right now I'm simply letting my eyes move around the room. I'm looking out the window. I'm actually looking at trees in the sky and different things that are moving, colors, shapes. I might be looking at something really far away and then look at something close. And I'm also, when I'm doing this, I'm kind of having this kind of open, wide-angle lens. I'm really opening my awareness and my eyes up. So then I come inside, I'm noticing colors, I'm noticing shapes. Some other ways, if you're really feeling activated, that can help is maybe noticing all the blue things in the room, or noticing all the red things in the room, noticing, details, things that you really like. So I might find 3 things in the room that I really like, that make me feel kind of good, or resources, and I might just spend a little time noticing the colors and the details of that particular picture, or whatever it might be, or particular thing in the room. Or the same thing if I'm looking outside, I'm noticing things that are kind of resources, things that I like. And so that's orienting. Orienting can be very, very helpful. It takes us out of the story, takes us out of the mind, and opens things up a bit, and also helps the nervous system to begin to settle. The next thing I'd like to talk about is grounding. And so we've all heard this term grounding before, but it can be, again, it's a very simple kind of practice or exercise, but it can be very helpful in helping us to deal with activation and anxiety and such things. Again, it kind of takes us out of the story, and it shifts our attention to something else. And the wonderful thing and the really helpful thing is that it gets us into more of our body, which we're going to talk about as we go on, about how important it is to spread out our awareness in the body, to have awareness of as much of the body as possible. So when it comes to grounding, I begin with my pelvis. I just kind of check in, and I notice how my sit bones, my pelvis, are connected to, if I'm sitting down, of course, connected to the chair that I'm sitting on, or the ground. It can be very helpful to sit down or sit down on the ground or in a chair. If you're standing up, then of course I'm going to start usually with my feet and my legs. I'm just going to kind of notice my legs and my feet. I'm noticing the sensations of that connection, the very simple, subtle sensations of my feet touching the ground, of muscles. I'm noticing the kind of heaviness of my body. If I'm sitting in a chair, I'm noticing my back and my spine against the chair. That can be really helpful. And again, if I'm standing, I also might be noticing my pelvis, which is kind of the center of my body, and noticing how that feels. So that's another really wonderful tool. Grounding is something that's a kind of go-to for me when I'm experiencing activation. One of the things that can be really helpful in working with and managing stress and activation and anxiety is being able to notice, as we talked about earlier, noticing as much of the body as possible, right? So if we are experiencing, let's say we're experiencing anxiety or activation or energy in the chest, the sensation in the chest, which can feel like very tight or kind of activated. And so if we bring all of our awareness into this one little spot, it's going to feel bigger because the space in which our awareness is seeing it or viewing it or experiencing it is quite small, which makes the sensation or the energy or the activation feel even bigger. So if I can shift or move my awareness out into more of my body, and we can think of these things here as kind of tubes, these legs and these arms especially, if we can bring our awareness out into the arms and the legs and just as much of the body as possible to view the sensation of activation or anxiety, to really be able to be with it and view it. And it's kind of like surfing, right? It's like riding this wave, but if I can do it from more of my body, the energy is going to actually expand out. It's going to kind of, there's an old saying that says, energy flows where awareness goes, right? So if I can be aware of more of my body, the energy is going to be able to spread out a bit more, and when it spreads out, it's not going to feel as overwhelming. So that can be really, really helpful. Okay, so as we talked about in the beginning, sometimes the anxiety, what we're calling anxiety, or the energy or the activation that we feel, is actually being created by the body to do something. So a lot of times, energy is created to do something, and it could be something as simple as running, wanting to run away. These days, like I went into the store the other day, the grocery store, and I noticed my body was tightening up. And when I checked in and kind of asked the energy and the anxiety what it wanted to do two things. It wanted to get out of the store, it wanted to run, and it also wanted to tighten up in a little ball. So a kind of protective response, right? A defensive response or a threat response. So sometimes, like we talked about in the beginning, this is a kind of different relationship with the energy or the activation. If we can kind of open to that, have this curiosity about the energy, and then maybe ask the energy if this energy could do something, what would it do? And then so let's say that the answer is I'd like to run. You feel energy in your legs or in your body, and it feels like you want to run. So then I would say imagine running as far and as fast as you want, and then to kind of close your eyes and just imagine running to some place that you want to run to, probably a safe place, and then just feeling the movement of the legs, right? The wind blowing in your face, and just continually doing that until you feel like this deep breath comes in, and then there's a settling, which is really great because it means that the system is kind of resetting itself, like you've completed the defensive response. You are mobilizing the energy. You are helping the energy to organize and to then complete itself. So this can be really helpful. It's a good place to start sometimes, because a lot of times we misunderstand or misinterpret or perceive the energy we feel in our body or the activation that we feel as some problem or something that's wrong. And sometimes it really, like I said in the beginning, it can be just energy is arising in the body to do something. A lot of times this happens. The energy or the feelings that we feel are there for a particular reason. If we can help create a curiosity, a more open relationship, and kind of hang out with these feelings and energies, then we can help them to move through. It's kind of like, riding this wave of activation, like surfing in a way. Okay, so I'd like to talk about a few more tools or practices that can be really helpful in working with stress and overwhelm and anxiety. So one of the things that can be quite helpful for some of us is kind of containment. Sometimes when we feel more contained, it can help reduce the amount of stress that we feel and help to create a little bit more regulation in the body. So one of the ways that I create containment is I take my right hand, so do this with me, kind of try it out. So I take my right hand, right, and I put it underneath my underarm here, my left underarm, and then I take my left hand and I put it on my shoulder, right, and I squeeze until I feel just the right amount of pressure for me, right? So it's going to be relative to each one of you, but just kind of finding that perfect spot where it feels comfortable, and then just kind of hanging out and noticing that you're in this body, that you're in this container. So feeling the outside of the body and feeling the pressure. And then you can see I have a deeper breath that comes in. And so this can be a really helpful little tool when you're feeling anxious or some activation that's challenging. One of the other things that I like to do is work with touch. And so self-touch can be really helpful when it comes to working with activation. And so one of the things I do all the time for myself is I take my right hand, it could, whichever way works for you, but I put one of my hands on my chest, right here, and I put my other one on my other hand on my gut, and I just begin to, I kind of close my eyes. For me, that works. I notice just the outside of my skin. So I notice the sensation of my hand being there and being on my gut. The next thing I notice is there's a kind of heat that I notice. So I notice a little bit of heat from my hand being there. And then I just kind of feel into that, like a supportive touch. I just feel the support of a touch on my chest and touch on my gut. And after a while, this can be very, very helpful. And so you want to kind of, one of the things that we want to remember, same thing with this piece, is that, again, we're coming back to this relationship with the activation, right? So I'm not trying to get rid of it. I'm just trying to create a better container and a way of helping it to complete itself, right? Really, really important. None of these tools that we're talking about today are about getting rid of it. It's about helping it to move, helping it to complete itself, right? Helping the system to settle, but not because I want to get rid of it, not because I hate it or it shouldn't be happening, but just because this is how I create a more inviting environment, and so that the energy can move through and without us being afraid of it and creating even more anxiety or more activation. So this is a really important one. Another one that we can do is I'll take one of my hands and put it here on my frontal lobe, neocortex area here, and then I'll put my other hand on what I call the cranial diaphragm here, right, where the brainstem is. And this can be really lovely too, especially if you're sitting down and you have a chair to kind of help hold your hands a little bit. This can be very, very settling, right? So remembering this one. And the reason we have so many different tools to work with these is because each person is going to be a little bit different. Their nervous system is going to be a little bit different. The kind of activation that you're experiencing might be a little bit different. Different things work for different people. So that's why we have all these different tools for you. And another tool, one that I forgot to mention a little bit earlier, is another kind of simple tool, and that is to take my hands and squeeze my thighs, right? I don't know if you can see my thighs, you probably can't, but I'm just squeezing again until it feels comfortable, and just noticing, again, I'm bringing my awareness down into my thighs and my legs, and that can also be very helpful. So earlier we were talking about how one of the reasons that we experience anxiety is because there's an overestimation of perceived danger. The second part of that was that there's an underestimation of coping skills and resources. So I'd like to take a few moments to talk about that. So a lot of times of course we have this overestimation of perceived danger, which means that we're perceiving that something bad could happen that creates anxiety. But other times it can be that we're in a serious situation, a challenging situation, but we actually forget that we have tools and resources and coping strategies that can help us in that moment. Like we literally forget that we can survive, that we can get out of this. So it's really important to pause sometimes when you're in a situation where you're feeling anxious about what's happening, and remember that you have some tools. We've talked about some tools here. You have those tools. You have all kinds of things that you have done in the past to survive and cope with certain things. And also, I think it's really important to remember that our ancestors, right, from the beginning of time, human existence, have been surviving and dealing with really scary and challenging things. And in a way, that's in our DNA, right? They survived, and they passed on those survival skills to us. So really taking a moment to realize that you have this kind of tool belt, or you have this backpack full of tools that can help you, and you might actually, this can be really helpful for dealing with especially kinds of stress and anxiety that you feel all the time. You might think about the situation, like let's say getting on an airplane, and you might think about what tools do I have before I get into that challenging situation. What tools do I have? And then think about being able to use those tools, and maybe you notice that as you think about using certain tools in a certain situation, that already you feel less anxious. Okay, the final thing I'd like to talk about is self-care. So just some simple things that you can do to help reduce stress and overwhelm, and help prevent a little of this from kind of overwhelming you and getting the best of you. So some simple things that we can do as far as self-care would be getting a good night's sleep, exercise, eating well. Routines are really important. Having some kind of routine, getting out, doing things that you really enjoy. It's been shown that a brisk walk around the block can be even more important, or more beneficial than even some medications. So things like that. Less media, not taking in as much news and social media. Especially if you start to notice that you're getting really activated, you want to kind of limit that a little bit. You don't need to be doing that all day. There's nothing wrong with getting some of that, but certainly you want to limit that. So sometimes when we're dealing with anxiety, we're dealing with overwhelm, especially when it's from past trauma and some really challenging things that are going on in your life, you need other people, right? Social engagement. You need friends, maybe a counselor, somebody to help you hold the space for what you're experiencing. And so, not being afraid to seek some help, because it can be very, very challenging sometimes to deal with anxiety, overwhelm, and activation in the system. So definitely do that if you need to. Okay, so this is the end of our episode, and I hope this has been really helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them here below, or you can email me. You can go to my website and find my email there, naturalbodhi.com. Please subscribe, and yeah, be safe and well, and I really look forward to seeing you again in future episodes. Thanks so much.